The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The Gospel of the Lord. So, one of the problems that I always face as a preacher when I'm writing a sermon every week is I wonder, how do I start the sermon? Because I want to set the tone and I want to draw people in. I want people to start thinking in big picture about the things that I'm going to talk about. And so, from a professional standpoint, I am always interested to see how other people start sermons. And in fact, that is what Matthew has done in today's gospel reading. These verses that I just read are the beginning of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's a sermon that begins as Jesus goes up a mountain and he sits down, which was the traditional posture for teaching and preaching. We don't do that anymore because if I stood up and said, "Hey, I'm going to preach a sermon now, and I'm going to sit down here and be comfortable while I talk," everybody would go, "How long is this going to go on for?" And indeed, Jesus goes on for another 3 chapters in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in all likelihood, Jesus probably didn't say all of these 3 chapters in one sitting. Rather, these things are probably a collection of sayings of Jesus that Matthew has put together and formed into this sermon. And so this beginning, these Beatitudes, these who's blessed and everything, they are not simply a selection of sayings that randomly appear, but Matthew has chosen these as the very beginning of the sermon because he wants to set a big picture vision of what Jesus is going to be saying and teaching about for the next 3 chapters. He wanted people to get in their hearts and heads a vision that would allow them to understand and appreciate more fully everything else that Jesus had to say. So what is this big picture that we're supposed to get from the Beatitudes? Rather than simply look at them as just an isolated bunch and then we go on to something else, if they're the beginning of the sermon that's supposed to set the tone, what is it that we're supposed to get from them? What's the big picture vision? When viewed that way, I see at least 3 important themes in the Beatitudes that always keep popping up again and again in everything that Jesus teaches us about how to live as his disciples. Already in the beginning of this sermon, Jesus' words point us to understanding that being his disciples is about living with hope and confidence that God really is in control of history no matter what happens. And if God is in control, then we do not have to be. And it's only because of this that people can rejoice even when bad things happen. Not because we are called to be masochists or enjoy the bad things, but because in the end, the bad stuff will not win out. This is the hope to which Jesus calls us. And it's also why it is always necessary to read these Beatitudes in the light of the resurrection at the end. Because if the person who tells you, "Rejoice when you're picked on, beaten up, persecuted, and even killed," gets picked up, beaten up, persecuted, and killed, and that's it, then those words don't mean much. But if the person who says this is the person who actually is persecuted, beaten up, killed, and rises again, and then says, "Look, this is not the end. This is not all there is more," then that changes how you can deal with all the bad stuff that goes on in your life. And that is a theme that Jesus will continue to raise again and again. These Beatitudes remind us that one of the major themes of being a disciple of Jesus is to seek a deeper relationship with God. Being disciples isn't simply about going through religious motions, but growing closer to God. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness is not about becoming self-righteous rather, but about seeking to grow in our relationship with God, who alone is righteous. And this is why over and over again Jesus contrasts righteousness, true righteousness, with the kind of self-absorbed religiosity that so many people around him seem to show. And even at the beginning of this sermon, in these Beatitudes, Jesus shows us that living as a community of his disciples is about being in community with others. Because over the course of history, lots of religions and spiritual movements, back then and today, have focused only on your own personal sense of peace and security. But Jesus calls people back to the early vision of God's covenant, in which God calls people not only to make peace with God, but to make peace with one another. A peace that is not simply détente, but that actually promotes community and wholeness with one another. So this year in confirmation, we've been studying the Ten Commandments, and one of the things that I always point out to the kids is that most of the commandments are about how we live with each other, because God cares even more, it seems, about how we form community with each other than the fact that we're living in a right relationship with God. They are like two sides of the same coin. We have to do one if we're going to do the other. So how does this big vision, this big picture, help us to live as a community of Jesus' disciples, both individually and as a congregation? So today, as we head into our annual meeting, we ought to keep in mind that a congregational meeting is more than actually a duty to elect council members, pass a budget, and hear some reports. Instead, if we do it right, it's really about us as a community looking in big picture at our call to be a community of Jesus' disciples in the coming year. And while living as a community of Jesus' disciples does require paying attention to certain details that we've got to do every year in a meeting, those details are supposed to serve the bigger picture. And the big picture for us should also be that same big picture that Jesus gave to his first disciples in these Beatitudes. As we move into this next year of our life together, Jesus also calls us to be a community of disciples which lives into the future with hope and with confidence, not because we're sure that everything will go great for us, but because we're confident that God has made us part of something real and meaningful, and because we're certain that our future is ultimately in God's hands. And this is especially important as we move into a post-COVID time where COVID has really accelerated trends in which involvement and interest in churches in particular is dramatically declining, much less than it used to be, and the Beatitudes remind us that we are gathered together to serve and love God, not because it's popular or because we're going to be successful, but to be faithful, to live into God's future, which is still certain, even when the society around us often doesn't seem to care that much anymore. For us too, as we move into a new year as a congregation, Jesus calls us to be a community that seeks to deepen our relationship with God. You know, things like hungering and thirsting after righteousness begin with seeking to be more deeply connected to God. It's about prayer, reflection, worship, and learning. These are the things which ground us and guide us into being God's people in the community around us and in the world around us. And they're the things that really we need Christian community to do. Nobody else is going to do these things for us if we don't find a way to do them together. And sometimes I'm worried because I read stuff, I get emails sometimes from national and regional church leaders that seem to suggest that because fewer and fewer people in our society seem interested in these sort of religious aspects of church, maybe we should just focus on the kind of fellowship things we do or the social justice things that we're involved with that would appeal to people who really aren't into like the Jesus stuff. And we do lots of great stuff like that, and we should. But without the hub of this deep and abiding relationship with God, the wheel of Christian community just falls apart. I often think about what we do kind of like the old spoked wheel, that the hub is our relationship with God. And all the stuff that comes out from the spokes, all the things that we do to care for others and to have fellowship and all these kinds of things are kind of like the spokes. And if we don't have that hub, then we've lost everything. And part of what Jesus is calling us to do in the Beatitudes is not to short shrift that deep and abiding relationship that we're supposed to grow in with God every day. And for us too, then, being a community of Jesus' disciples means that we have to be serious about building community with others. As with Jesus' first followers, we're not only called to deepen our relationship with God, but also to deepen our community with each other. Inherent to this idea that those who suffer are blessed is the notion that each of us can be an instrument of God's blessing when we stand with, or even as Jesus did, we sit with somebody we know who is in a difficult spot in their lives right now. One of the things we have stressed in the past year, and we will this year also, is the need for us to be together and to have fellowship with each other. It's one of the reasons why the fellowship team is setting up all of this stuff before the meeting, because what we're supposed to do when we gather together as a community is to be bonded together to each other and not just to be here to do a business thing. And part of the reason that that's so important is that it's by building relationships with each other that we can be God's agents of help and care in each other's lives when those times of need inevitably show up. Matthew began the Sermon on the Mount by remembering Jesus' big picture vision of what being disciples of Jesus was really all about. He did that because he knew that without the big picture, disciples can get distracted and lost. We can end up becoming fearful, going about religious motions, and forgetting one another. And so these words of Jesus remind us again today of what our mission as a community of disciples is really all about. As followers of Jesus, we're called each day and each year to be people who seek to deepen and to grow in our relationship with God. We're called each day and each year to be people who build community with each other and with the neighbors God has given us. And we're called each day and each year to face the future with hope and with confidence, not because we know exactly what the future is going to bring, but because we know that our future really is finally in God's hands. Amen.